Velkommen til Rig på Viden, en podcast om forskning i investering, finans og økonomi. Mit navn er Andrea Thormann. Episoden har vi lavet i samarbejde med Nordic Finance and the Good Society for at kaste nyt lys på finanssektoren i Norden og diskutere en mere ansvarlig retning for sektoren i fremtiden. Målet om at udbrede forskning inden for området og skabe debat om den finansielle sektor støtter vi 100% op om. Tag et kig på deres hjemmeside nfgs.dk, hvor der ligger masser af fed forskning og seminarer om ledelse, bæredygtighed, pengepolitik og meget mere.
This podcast episode is about anti-money laundering, and today I have invited Kalle Johannes Rose to the studio. Kalle, welcome to.
Thank you.
Kalle, would you please give a brief introduction about yourself, background and career?
Yeah, so my name is Kalle Johannes Rose. I'm an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School. I have a background in law and economics, a PhD in law and economics. Then I spent some time at the Danish Financial Supervisory Authority, where I got my interest for anti-money laundering. I was sitting at the Office of Anti-Money Laundering and FinTech. Then I went back to the academic sector as an assistant professor, and I kept on digging into the interesting world of money laundering.
Yes. And money laundering, anti-money laundering is also called AML.
Yes.
And just in general, what is it?
Well, it's a quite interesting field because money laundering is a crime in itself, but it depends on a pre-assessing crime. So there needs to be a crime before money laundering can actually happen. So you have a crime that will give some proceeds, money typically. You need these money to be laundered because you need to disguise the origin of the original crime. So you need to you got $1 million out of, it could be everything from a murder to a bank robbery, and then you need to use this money for investment purposes or other, but the bank or another financial institution would never allow you just to bring $1 million into cash, and hence you must do a process to try to disguise the origin so they can't see where you originally got the money from.
And money laundering, is that typically due by professionals, organizations, or from where do we see these activities?
We typically divide money launderers into two categories. There's the professional money launderers, and then there's the unprofessional. Unprofessional will typically, that's the one getting caught. That will also be the basic employer who doesn't pay taxes, or what would say small level of money laundering. When we have the other group, the organized money laundering, that is a professional service provider in itself. So here we will typically have a network of lawyers, accountants, and expertise that will go in and kind of act like a service provider. So you buy the money laundering service.
And your research, is that rather focused on the professional side, or the unprofessional? What's the most interesting thing?
For me, the most interesting thing is, of course, the professional, the organized crime, because the unprofessional, that is, for the first, it is one that we catch. More than 90% of all cases are about unprofessional money laundering. So we want to dive in and investigate the organized crime, also because here you can actually, here's the challenge. The challenge lies with the professionalism, because you can see that there will typically always be legal assistant, accountants, so people who knows the system, knows the regulation, and that is kind of also where the tricky parts comes in, because, and for researchers, the fun parts, because when I do law and economics, it is about looking at the incentives, looking at the regulation, and try to find the loopholes. What would I do if I was a professional money launderer, and dig into that and try to elaborate on the mistakes or the errors in the regulation.
I also think it's quite interesting because you said that all the unprofessionals are those getting caught, but this might cause a data issue for you if you want to analyze all the professionals if they're not getting caught?
Well, and this is why so typically what we see is that the big cases are the one getting exposed by journalists. So we had the Panama Papers, we have all these. So that is when we talk about organized crime. So I also spent some time with the media because they actually get the good data from secret sources. Because if you go to the police intelligence, you can get some data, but that would be about unprofessional money launderers typically.
I think the Panama Papers is a great example. So did this case contributed a lot to the general research within money laundering?
Well, we have to acknowledge that there's a huge lack of research in terms of money laundering, both in terms of anti-money laundering, so the intelligence of finding money launderers and prevent them from misusing the financial system, but also in terms of getting to know them better, because it is a defense system we've set up. So we need to know our enemy, and we still have a lot of lacking here. What the Panama Papers did was more bring focus on how vulnerable our financial, very globalized, trustworthy and trust-based system has been. It set really some focus on how quick professional money launderers, how they act across borders, and the extent and excessive amount of money that is being transferred illegally across our financial system.
Do you have any idea who our enemy is? Typically, when we talk about cybersecurity, we're also talking about the Western economies versus Russia and China. But what about within anti-money laundering? Where are our enemies?
So again, we kind of had to divide it because, of course, we have there are some politics included in all of this, because whenever there's regulation, what we consider being legal or illegal will, of course, be different in Russia, in China. So we have to divide it in there's the national or the regional Western politics, Western kind of legal society, where there's changes between that and other regions. And then there's what is considered being illegal across the whole globe. So when we talk about the FATF recommendation, the international UN recommendation and area, here it's something that we all agree upon across the world, that this is illegal. So when we adopt these definitions of money laundering, we have to look at it in a global context, understanding that what is criminal in one country might not be criminal in another country. But we have some agreements on corruption, bribery, which is transversal across the whole globe. And here we can say that we all agree, at least.
Mm. And if we go a bit back in time, you had to make a decision. This should be your research field. How did you got your very first interest in money laundering?
It actually goes really far. I remember already as a kid, I don't know why, but I had a huge worry about what would I do if I didn't succeed. So I started trying to, I learned myself how to pick locks, and also try to steal from my parents, see if they noticed, and then give it back, and just send. I was very interested in being a criminal without going to the actual effort of being a criminal. So I had some interest already back then, but my primary interest came when I went to the FSA after writing my PhD in law and economics. So I already have an interest for the criminal side. I also tried to go for a job in the police intelligence service, and so there's something latent. And when I was at the Danish FSA, we were in the implementation process of the 4th anti-money laundering directive, hence giving me a great look into how this whole legislative process and how should we transfer a system going from a non-risk-based to a risk-based system. So looking at all the deficiencies, that kind of sparked something in me.
Fortunately, you choose the legal way. But there are some people who don't, and usually we talk about that money laundering is used to finance terror. You say that we don't really know our enemies, and the data is quite limited, but we still have some ideas that it's used for terror financing. How do we know that?
So when we talk about money laundering, it's a crime. You have the best case is going back to the old movies. We know the mafia. We know all of these old classic kind of money laundering setups. So there we have criminal activities. It could be drug trade. It could be trafficking that leads to some money being paid out, typically in cash. We need to launder these money because we want to reinvest in further illegal businesses, or maybe buy a luxury yacht. So this demands a money laundering process. So when we talk about money laundering, we talk about illegal activities which ends up with a good profit that we need to launder so we can disguise the illegal origin. There's a big difference when we talk about terrorist financing, because terrorist financing is you or me having a political aim that we want to sponsor or support. So it's not that we run a business that will give us some profit, that we then invest in something. Terror financing is driven by a political goal. So it can also be a religious goal. So it's two very distinct different types. The reason why we put it and always talk about it together is because it's forced together by regulation. So what we saw is when we wanted to construct the AML-CFT regulation, we mixed them together because what can limit the misuse of the financial system for money laundering purposes, well, that's monitoring transactions, and all of these things is also the things that would limit the misuse of the financial system for terrorist purposes or terrorist financing. So we kind of had the same structure. We were setting up a surveillance system because that's basically what the regulation is. So setting up the surveillance system, we could easily take terrorist financing in the AML agenda because we were already doing it. What we needed to just surveil was another technique. So instead of money going in from businesses, it's more the other way around. It's money going typically out of, for example, Europe to other regions to support political or religious purposes.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, it's also about some implementation issues of regulation.
Yes. Everything around this field is kind of based on politics and regulations, because we have to face up to the truth that before 2016 and the implementation of the fourth directive, the big money laundering scandals in Europe, Danske Bank, Swedbank, Paris BNP, and everything that happened in those years just after 2016, no one really enforced the regulation. And when we combine terrorist financing, well, that was pretty much due to the 9/11 attack. So there's a lot of politics into this kind of structure and the regulative process that we've been through the last 20 years.
Yes. So that was a bit about the background. And to sum up, you're part of a research project called the Nordic Finance and Good Society. And you state that it's time for regulators, private entities, and politicians to debate what an acceptable amount of money laundering is. So now we're not talking about it should be unacceptable. Instead, we should find an acceptable threshold.
Yes.
So why should money laundering be accepted and at a certain threshold?
Yeah, so it is quite complicated, but before we go into the subject of money laundering, we first have to understand risk-based regulation. So in 2000, with the implementation of the fourth money laundering directive, what we did was we transferred the regulation from being standard and rule-based to be based on risk. When we do this, we're transforming a technical substance here. So the best way to explain it is to look at the health sector. We've all been through the corona pandemic. And if we were to prioritize under a global pandemic that had many sacrifices, people with broken arms or regular surgeries, instead of trying to limit this pandemic, we would have prioritized wrong, and this would not be in line with risk. So when we talk about risk-based regulation, this is exactly what it is. We're regulating our efforts toward the risk that we are exposed to. When we then move to the money laundering regulation, well, we know that money laundering is happening out there. But if we do not agree on some and I know it's politically totally incorrect to say, but we need to, if we do not agree on an acceptance level, we cannot use the resources that we have effectively. So what we've seen in Denmark and what we also see in other countries is that we have the larger banks, due to all these scandals and the political pressure and the media pressure, they've started to report immensely. And there's a lot of reporting to the FIUs across the EU. We still had a lot of entities that don't report anything. Even the banks are saying this is not an effective means of our resources. But we cannot be effective if we don't have a threshold. So imagine that you have a health system, a healthcare system, where you had unlimited amount of money. That would be like...
Sounds like a great country.
It's a great country, but even in the Scandinavian countries where we actually have great expenditures on healthcare, we have a limit. So at some point we must say, okay, do we need to intensify? Do we need to use more money to save more lives? Or is this the threshold? We accept in our country, in all countries, we accept a certain level of death, of sickness, because it is not profitable not to do so. So we are exposed by health risk all the time, and politicians set a standard, set a level of how much should we pay in taxes to try to contradict this risk, to manage to mitigate the risk. This is just to give an example of the issue with money laundering. In terms of anti-money laundering, we do not have this threshold. And what it does, it makes an uneven, not effective investment here. Because if you don't agree on an acceptance level, you can choose to not accept anything. That would be zero risk. And that tends to be where the larger banks are going right now in Europe, because regulators are after them. We have the FSAs across Europe inducing fines and coming out doing inspections. But zero risk is not an option.
Yeah, so zero risk in practical for the hospitality service, that would be if they said, we have zero risk that no one dies at our hospital.
That would be treating everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
No matter the cost.
No matter the cost. And this is the same thinking we should apply on anti-money laundering.
Yes. We need to have an acceptance level where we do. Zero risk doesn't exist, because that would be treating everyone. Then you should report on all suspicious activity. That doesn't make sense, because we should only report when suspicious activity is significant. And then we should also report across the financial sector where we actually see the risk. This demands a collaboration between the public entities and the private entities. When we look at the healthcare system as a measure of reflection, what they have is that they can decide it themselves. They operate the hospitals, but they are also the one with the budget. They have the insight, they have the intelligence, they know how many people are getting killed. It might not be publicly available data on the decision making, but we know that, okay, we do not have an infinite amount of taxpayer money that we can use in this sector. When we go to the anti-money laundering defense line, we have a division. We have a public sector interest, meaning we want to safeguard our financial system from being misused for criminal purposes. And then we have the private parties who's the operating part. That is the bank, that is everyone who's under this type of regulation. They have to report suspicious activity. But if the operating side doesn't know where to lay the risk acceptance level, they need to report all the time to make sure they don't get a fine. So you could imagine if a hospital would get fined for not treating people. If we took a private hospital and they would get fined for not treating people in accordance to politicians saying that everyone needs to be safeguarded, that it would be the same dilemma. Mm. So we need to talk about risk acceptance, because zero risk is not an option in this world. And everyone within the financial sector knows that zero risk doesn't really function. It's not in line with reality. So when we have these estimates that we've seen in research about, they're typically between 2 to 7, 8% of the GDP, and that is being laundered every year. What we should, instead of estimating that part, which is quite hard also because it's unknown territory, how do you estimate someone who's in disguising, misusing your system? It can be hard. Yeah. We should try to say, okay, let's look at this system and talk about what would we accept. How much criminal intention, how much criminal profit would we accept? And I know it's a provocative statement, but we need to set that line. Let's say it's 1%. When we set that line, then we can talk about how do we then allocate our resources? How many resources should we spend? Because we haven't even taken that discussion. Because it is the private parties, it is the banks, it is everyone else, banks, lawyers, accountants, who are now having the cost of the AML regulation and not the public side. So you have the bearer of the cost is the private sector. The ones who doesn't know the acceptance level and need it to be effective is the private sector. The only one who can set the acceptance level and who is regulating this part is the public sector. But there's no sharing of this information because we're not even talking about it. We're not even talking about how many money should we use, which we would know from the health system. Then we would know in terms of tax, how much money are we willing to pay for our services. So there are some issues, and this is what we brought out in the white paper, saying that there are some things that we need not just to discuss in our society, but also to bring forth in the research that we're trying to come forth with here, is that we need to talk about acceptance level, but of course also a cost kind of measurement, because no one has said to a bank, okay, you're allowed to spend 1% on AML reduction. Right now we have banks spending up to 10% of their employees on compliance issues related to financial crime. But is the public sector using 10%? No, they're not, because 10% of the tax dollars, taxpayers' money, would be a lot. So there's a divergence here, and we need to align this if we need to have an effective kind of system or defense line towards this type of crime.
We have also seen action from the financial sector in increasing reporting from suspicious transactions. You have written in your white paper it has increased from about 20,000 yearly to almost 90,000 in 2020. So there's a lot to handle here also from regulator side if they are receiving all these regulations. I'm thinking about if we are imposing this risk-based regulation, what kind of threshold? Because you cannot, I think you cannot measure right now how much activities are actually under money laundering? How can we put on 1% level? What should we measure? So would the solution be, as you mentioned, some banks are using 10% of their employees on AML to put those kind of standards, or how can we put standards on a quantitative way for risk-based regulation?
So we already know that these political agreements exist, because what we could do is we could compare the public side interest and how much money have they spent on employees on this field. And this is something we're looking into now data-wise, to see how is the public side prioritizing this field in terms of saying, is that the same prioritization we look at the private sector? Because we need to have kind of an alignment. We also need to understand that when we're talking about the AML, CFT, this is a defense line. So everyone needs to put in the same amount of resources and agree on what is the risk exposure. Right now, that is not what is happening. There's different types of cost or investments in crime reduction, if you're on the private or the public side, but there's also different levels depending on which sector, which type of company, and even on the public side, which area, because that depends on politics. So there's a lack, and we also seen this in the national strategy reports from the Danish Financial Intelligence Unit, that there's a lack of academic research, and what we will go into is trying to get access to these data, because we need to align and set this standard. Because if we want to have effective resource allocation, we need to first get an acceptance level and then find out how much money should we use. Because right now we're just spending, some are spending a lot of money and some aren't spending anything. There's of course difference in the risk exposure from a larger bank to a smaller bank. But that risk exposure needs to be disclosed between the public and the private side.
Yeah. But then this is also a quite important assumption if we say that the spending should be equal between financial institutions and the public sector. In this assumption, we think that the public sector spending is sufficient. Do you think that?
I don't necessarily think it's sufficient, but I think it represents the political lining. So, of course, we are allowed to oblige private entities to do more than we do in public investment. When I say that we will look at it, it's not that it has to be one-on-one, because of course there won't be as many employees in the FSA looking at the AML as there will be in the total regime of the financial sector, because they of course have to surveil. There's a much larger task. But to use an analogy, if we looked at our police force, if we should compare that with the banks right now, what we see in terms of the behavior is that we're kind of demanding that the banks are setting out policemen on every corner of the street. That is not effective. And if we look at the public side, this is not what's happening in our society. We do accept crime. We do accept crime to a certain level. We do accept that we have gangs. We do, even in Denmark, we do accept that we have, until recently, accepted publicly open drug trade in the center of Copenhagen. I mean, there's some levels that we do accept. It's just not disclosed publicly. But that doesn't matter as long as the police force is on the public side. The problem arises that the ones being the operative party here is the private sector. But they're threatened by fines, by everything else. And therefore, they thrive more and more closely to kind of a zero-risk behavior. And that is contradicting the regulation, because the regulation is risk-based. It demands effective resource allocation. It actually demands every member state in the EU to secure an effective resource allocation. And to make this happen, all academic literature, even though it's scarce, points at the first thing we need to look at is agree on the amount. What is the cost? How much should we spend on this field? And then agree on an acceptance level before we can allocate the resources correctly. So right now we're seeing a situation that is actually not complying with the regulation.
So right now, banks, they could potentially spend all their income on anti-money laundering because that will never be defeated, and that's the current regulation wants it to be.
There's such a huge fear after we saw the Danske Bank scandal of what we would say the public court, and what would a fine be, and that thrives for this over-investment, and it might be on point. Maybe this is what is wrong. Maybe the 90,000 reports is an exactly efficient level. But we don't know, because we can't talk about effectiveness or efficiency when we have no one who sets a guideline for what do we accept in our society.
And the research is obviously quite limited within this field, but you're working in it and about to launch a new research project. What do you think that needs to be further on analyzed?
So first of all, we have we see a small opening in the data collection, but basically one of the problems in this area is not just the data collecting, but it's also we're kind of setting up, we have to push some political boundaries. And what I see and what I've raised at certain levels and different times is that we need a regulatory change in Denmark. We're quite restrictive in Denmark in terms of what we want and what we don't want. And now it becomes really technical in a legal term, and it's not very popular to go or very sexy to go that direction. But there are some things, restrictions in the Danish legislation and the way that we can't even give fines. Our FSA can't really give fines to financial institutions without them accepting that they're doing something criminal. And so this whole setup, how we arranged our legal system, is not in line with risk-based regulation. So we can't even comply. So there's a mixed match here between the EU regulation and what we want to do in terms of Danish politics. And when we talk with the Ministry of Justice, of course they bring up constitutional rights, etc. And of course we cannot clash with constitutional rights. What seems funny is that we have neighboring countries with similar constitutions that interpret them in a different way and opens the access for these incentives and risk-based regulatory regimes that we need. So there's multiple assets or what we say areas that we need to investigate, but some of it is also not just for academics to say that this is wrong, but also for politics to react on what we're kind of already saying in academics, because it is quite already stated. But we can keep proving that this is not in line, this is not, we're not complying with EU law, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. But if it doesn't get an impact, it doesn't really do anything. So there's some research areas which we've already been into, risk acceptance, this whole risk regulatory, how does it even fit the Danish culture? Because if we cannot get that structure right, it doesn't matter if it's AML or if it's the ESG will demand the same, cybersecurity rules will demand the same. We have all these EU regulatory schemes that are coming in large frameworks, will hit all industries. But so far we haven't designed our own system to comply with these type of EU regulations. So it's a heavy load because you kind of need to change the behavior for a whole country. We do see some small lights ahead, which is not positive for Denmark itself, but we are looking forward to the new super financial supervisory authority in the EU called the AMLA, which will come, and it will have a monitoring role, also looking into the supervisory authorities, also the legal framework. Are we even able to comply? Do we comply with the regulation? So the Danish, what we say, AML compliance as a country, because both countries and private institutions are part of this regulation, they will soon be under surveillance, and that might mix up, and we shouldn't expect to get a good evaluation, not in the first couple of years, because we need to do really groundbreaking legal changes in our society before we can even say that we can make risk-based regulation effective.
It seems like there's still a lot to do for you.
Sadly, whenever you dig into a field, that's kind of the conclusion, is you always get larger and larger problems. And well, I actually like the AML regulation because it's quite on tact. You're not sitting with a lot of legal principles. It's almost the easiest regulation to read if you understand a bit of risk management. But because it is so operational, because it is so technical, it's a functional law and it depends on risk, where we can see the largest issues is actually in terms of the rest of the legal discipline, because it's changing the fundamentals of law, especially in the civil law countries and the Nordic, legal tradition. And that demands a lot to change a whole kind of system just because we want it. So the regulation, I find it quite good. It's incentive based, it's economic, it's based on, well, I also have a background in law and economics, so we kind of like these regulations that aims at effectiveness, efficiency, proportionality, everything is in line. It's just risk-based, and that is the challenge of now.
Yes. Kalle Johannes Rose, I will let that be the final words. I will just thank you very much for participating in Rig på Viden.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Tak for, at du lyttede med til Rig på Viden. Jeg håber, at du lærte noget, og hvis du nu synes godt af vores podcast, så kan du støtte os ved at følge den på Spotify, eller skrive en anbefaling på iTunes. Inde på LinkedIn, der kan du følge André Thormann, Benjamin Somofen eller Henrik Fode Rasmussen. På genhør.